Okay, hi everybody, David Parsons here. This is Nostalgia Trap. I am ready to go if you are. If you have listened to our program at all, especially in the last year since the COVID crisis began, you know that a lot of what we talk about in terms of politics and capitalism, etc., we're sort of connecting to issues of life and death. We call it necropolitics, sometimes biopolitics. You know, the idea of who lives and who dies as mitigated by other forces like economic structures and political structures. All of that is on the table in the COVID year in a way that we've never really seen in our lifetimes before. And I think that it's something that connects to a really widespread discourse in American history, which is this discourse about human life and the value of human life. And my guest today has a lot to say about that. His name is Erik Baker. He's a doctoral candidate in the history of science at Harvard University, has an incredible article up at the Drift Mag right now. It's called The Cure and the Disease, Social Darwinism from AIDS to COVID-19. We'll put a link to that article in this episode description. But he's really connecting the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and this COVID year, and then investigating this wider idea of social Darwinism in American history and how it's played out, in particular anti-vaccination conspiracy theories. This stuff is so important and goes back into really, really deep trends in American thought and American politics. He's got a great take on all this stuff. So I appreciate Erik Baker coming on the show and letting us know what we need to know about these attitudes and where they come from. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. We've got lots more Nostalgia Trap stuff going on, including our live stream on YouTube every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific time. We're talking to Justin Rogers Cooper for the full hour for the first few weeks of the Biden administration as we try to get a grip on what is happening in American politics, because we think it's a pivotal moment. I know we're not the only ones that think that, but I think we're trying to sort of figure out where the left goes, especially during the Biden moment. So I hope you'll join us for that. And if you want to subscribe to our show, we've got bonus episodes. Always need your support. We only are supported by listeners, so you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, putting up lots of bonus episodes on movies and pop culture, particularly from the 80s and 90s, and getting a lot of great feedback on those. Enjoying the conversations we're having with our patrons. Come join us if you can at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Erik Baker. All right, Erik. Well, thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate your work. I just was reading your article in the Drift magazine. I cannot recommend it enough. And we can get right into it because the title of your article is the Cure and the Disease, Social Darwinism from AIDS to COVID-19. I love that title because we talk about the 19th century and try to connect the 19th century a lot to current times. And social Darwinism is something that, you know, when I think about that term, I think about like robber barons of the 19th century and their sort of explanations for the horrors of industrial capitalism. But how are you conceiving of social Darwinism as relating to disease? Because I think it's such a brilliant way of framing like what's going on in our politics around COVID. But how did you get to social Darwinism and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think this is my first podcast appearance since a precocious middle school friend discovered the medium in its early years. So,
Welcome back.
It's good to be talking about this piece. So I think there are sort of two answers to this question, one sort of straightforward and the other more convoluted. The straightforward answer is that social Darwinism sort of suggests itself naturally to this piece because the story that it tells is about an evolutionary biologist, principally W.D. Hamilton, who sort of saw himself as, in some ways, the Darwin of the 20th century, and was, made no secret of his interest in sort of extending Darwin to the social realm, because a lot of the 19th century social Darwinists, of course, there were plenty of professional scientists who were invested in the project of social Darwinism, but Darwin himself was a bit more ambivalent, and it was really sort of other expositors like Herbert Spencer who sort of made social Darwinism. So this guy, W.D. Hamilton, really saw his opportunity to sort of put the stamp of really legitimate science on this project. And then the other piece of it, as you mentioned, has to do with disease. And this is, social Darwinism is one of these terms that's become so entrenched in the vernacular that it's easy to sort of forget exactly how sinister some of the implications can be. But of course, if you're committed to thinking of society in literal Darwinist terms, then survival of the fittest implies that people don't survive, implies that the non-survival of the weaker. And of course, disease and epidemic disease are great opportunities for non-survival on a mass scale from the perspective of a social Darwinist. So, that this had been a story I'd been working on for some time. And then in the early days of the epidemic, I was just astonished to sort of see some of these more niche kind of hardcore social Darwinist ideas that I had discovered in the context of this story about HIV/AIDS really make an appearance at the highest levels of White House policymaking and conservative thinking about the response to the epidemic. So I wanted to draw the lines there.
Yeah, and you get into the history of AIDS in the 1980s, but also the sort of conspiracy theories around that, and it seems like it's obviously difficult not to make parallels between all the conspiracy theories with COVID and everything like that. But social Darwinism seems like the right frame, because it's funny to think about it as a sort of theory or something historically, but to watch it happen in front of us, I feel like your piece, for me, put in perspective that this social Darwinist thing was there in the sort of intellectual dark web, the Joe Rogan, like that sort of crowd, that's their whole thing. And I just want to point this out. And I wonder what your response to it is, because it made me think of your piece. Like, I don't know if people remember this, but Joe Rogan started getting really big as a podcaster when he had this appearance on the Jim Brewer podcast before Joe Rogan had a show, and he was describing what it was like to smoke DMT. Of course, that's his whole thing, right? Have you smoked DMT? And what he described, it's like this 6-minute clip. It went viral. This was before streaming even. I think I had the MP3. And Rogan says, I took DMT, and what I learned from it is that when you look down on Los Angeles from an airplane, you see a brown spot on the earth, and I realized that human beings are a disease, and that we are a disease on the planet, and that's all we are. And I thought it was interesting that interesting piece of psychological nugget from Joe Rogan, that's what he sees when he smokes DMT. But to me, it connects to what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the piece, I tell the story in his memoirs. Bill Hamilton talks about, as a grad student, walking through the streets of London as he is, immersing himself in his study of evolutionary biology and imagining this world depopulated, or what it would be like before human beings. And I mean, this is really the central conviction that he carries throughout his life. And so this is thank you for drawing this out. This is the other sort of double entendre to the title of the piece, that there is this sense that, and of course, it was really disturbing. It became sort of a social media meme, this idea that, COVID is showing us that maybe humans are the real virus.
That's right. Yep.
And there's this sort of, it's easy to sort of make fun of these kind of edgelord figures like Rogan who think this, but when it actually seeps into the level of real policymaking at the highest level, it's worth taking these ideas seriously because they're there and they're influential.
And can you describe how it's, because it's not just the intellectual dark web doing this? I mean, can you describe how that concept is sort of present in environmentalism and has been, because I feel like I hear that sort of attitude from environmental. Growing up in Southern California, again, surrounded by a sort of like environmentalist kind of Greenpeace, Sierra Club, liberal environmentalists was what I was surrounded by, and I feel like I heard that attitude among them as well.
Yeah, totally. So this is and right. I mean, a lot of the people who you saw on social media in the early days of the epidemic saying stuff like, the rivers of Venice are running clear again.
Nature is healing.
Nature is healing, right? These people, they often don't think of themselves as real right wingers, and that's not sort of their image, but there is this sort of strange connection. So in the piece, I distinguish between what I call Rachel Carson environmentalism and this other kind of more insidious environmentalism that after I published the piece, a friend suggested it could be called Garrett Hardin environmentalism after the person who developed the idea of the tragedy of the commons, which thinks of sort of in environmental protection environmental protection and threats to the environment as a sort of inherent product of the sort of selfishness and sinfulness of humanity, as opposed to the Carson wing, which focuses more precisely on the sort of consequences of industrial capitalism and corporate activity. And I think that these two tendencies, you can trace both of them back to the 19th century, but in this sort of post-war, 50s, 60s moment when the environmentalist movement is starting to emerge as a major force in American politics, it remains a really deep tension. And I think it persists to this day. This shows up in some of the controversy about the term, the concept of the Anthropocene. Is it humanity that is to blame? Obviously, on some sense, climate change is anthropogenic. It's caused by humans, but which specific humans? If you blame all humans, if you blame it on humanity per se, then it's very easy to adopt this kind of misanthropic attitude.
Right.
Humanity's the problem. Then getting rid of humanity, purging, getting back to nature, is the solution. And I think, so when I wrote this piece, I think that some of the stuff that I was describing caught people by surprise, but I think that people are a lot more familiar, even in the last couple of months, with the more insidious dimension of some of this discourse because of the shift of sort of wellness and, naturalness influencers to QAnon, to be honest.
Yeah.
Which we've seen on a huge scale, has really kind of shocked people. Like, how could someone go from like posting about, their sort of eating natural 6 months ago, now they're talking about, QAnon and storming the Capitol. Well, there is this sort of deep kind of reactionary dimension to this.
Yeah.
Way of thinking.
Yeah. And it calls to mind, things like the history of eugenics and like all sorts of, I'm looking at, it's the analogy always to Nazism, but like, the sort of genetic engineering that comes along with that. But I also just hear the word, like the concept overpopulation. I feel like that entered into the lexicon, entered the discourse at some point. Maybe in the 90s, 2000s, gained traction. I feel like a lot of stand-up comics, again, stand-up comedy, like they delivered a lot of this stuff to me, and I think into the sort of larger popular culture. The idea there's just too many people. There's just too many people. And I feel like that little meme, that little concept is really more like comes out as insidious in times like this when there are people dying and it becomes a rationale for that.
Yeah, completely. I mean, on the one hand, it is this concept again that you can trace all the way back to the 19th century and Thomas Malthus, and concern about overpopulation was really central to this sort of first wave of sort of, social Darwinism, and even before Darwin, proto social Darwinism, if you want to call it that. But then, in the 1970s, and I think you're right, even more so in the last couple of decades, it sort of takes off, because it's a way of it's a way of, I think, translating this sense that people have of sort of, something being sort of fundamentally out of balance, or a sense of almost kind of claustrophobia that people sometimes get in a sort of chaotic modern world, into this sort of really simple diagnosis and solution. Although people, most people who talk about overpopulation don't actually think all the way to the sort of solution side of things. I was actually over the holidays, I was bored and watching nature documentaries on Netflix, as I often do, and there's this new movie from David Attenborough, who's his sort of his testimony as he's in entering the last stage of his career. And it's all about overpopulation. But then at the end, he sort of draws back and he says, well, the good news is that as countries develop and, women get more rights, we're actually seeing a sort of decline in population growth. So it's this funny kind of, the problem is overpopulation. There are too many people, so then once you ask the obvious question, well, what are we going to do with all these people? Then there's this sort of Steven Pinker-esque kind of magic answer, well, actually, we won't have to do anything too alarming or appalling about this problem. It'll actually take care of itself through the magic of economic development. That's such a key part of this. I mean, these fuckers like Steven Pinker and Jordan Peterson, to me, that's one of the, I think maybe that's why the left goes after them so much, is because underneath all of this, and maybe not so underneath, on the surface, is like this naturalization of capitalism, and this sort of like acting like fucking capitalism is like a tree. It's just something, and that part of it is what is key to explaining why they think the way they think about human beings and systems. It's just like, well, this is just as nature working itself out. I mean, to me, one of the startling things that you mentioned, because you mentioned Jordan Peterson in your piece, is just this idea that Hamilton, the figure you're writing about, who's such an important figure for connecting all this stuff, but they're naturalizing war, genocide, racism. Like, those things are just things that happen. That to me is just so nihilistic, so terrifying. And yet, like you're saying, it was like the actual federal government policy for the last 9 months, more or less, and state governments too. Totally, and longer than that. I mean, because I make the argument in this piece, evolutionary psychology, way of thinking, and some of the policy around economics and business that's been entrenched in the last 4 or 5 decades of U.S. policy. And I tell this story in the paper, or in the article. But besides Bill Hamilton, E.O. Wilson is a biologist at Harvard, is another key figure in the sort of early years of this sort of reinvention of social Darwinism in the 70s. And he writes this book called Sociobiology that comes out in the mid 70s, and is really controversial, even among biologists, gets a lot of pushback. But one of the first papers that is really sort of trying to take this model and run with it is actually from none other than Gary Becker, is a prize-winning economist at the University of Chicago, who is really one of the fundamental figures of the sort of neoliberal Chicago School of Economics, and he, he sees the implications of all of this so plainly. It's this sort of amazing suggestion that maybe everything that he's been saying all along about economic actors and markets, maybe this really reflects these deep fundamental principles of nature itself. And that's an extremely exciting idea for these people, because it is, what's the, how can you escape, if it's baked into the fabric of reality at the level of, evolution itself and, life itself, then, what on earth is the point of imagining any alternatives to it?
Yeah. I mean, and it's so perfect for anti-communists too, because you hear, how many times have you heard like, well, Marx forgot a little thing called human nature, right?
Yeah. And that being said, the irony about all this is that, they can't, there's a contradiction here. And I think it's important to point out the contradiction, to not give this, ideology too much credit for its coherence, which is that, if you really had an attitude of sort of sitting back and letting nature take its course, then there's no reason that you would be particularly concerned about, the formation of a labor union, or, the erection of a national health insurance program. That if all of the social process is just a natural process that's sort of working itself out, then who are you to say that unions or Medicare for all are any less natural than markets and this other stuff that supposedly popped up organically? But of course, they can't help themselves, and so in the name of letting nature run its course, they support these policies that actually actively suppress unions, that actually actively set up structures to allow corporations to profit and consolidate their power. And you see this again in the COVID response, is that it wasn't just letting the virus run its course, but there was actually so much sabotage of these efforts. And we see there's the guy who just got arrested for deliberately letting these vaccines go to waste in some facility, in the name of letting things just work themselves out. It actually takes a lot of work.
Yeah, and it seems like so much of that energy of like sort of being antagonistic to any sort of intervention in the disease, whether it be like not wearing masks or saying that, well, the cure is actually worse than disease because we don't have businesses and restaurants open and things like that. I mean, it seems like it's concentrated, especially in the anti-vaccination movement. I don't know if you're going to call that movement. I feel like it's not located in one particular group now. I mean, I can think of anti-vaccination arguments coming from every part of society. But it seems like the story you tell in your piece in The Drift about this doctor, Hamilton, it's a really, I mean, to me, it's like a movie, because your article opens with him going to Congo, right? And attempting to. It sounds like he was trying to disprove or smear vaccines in some way. Can you explain what he was trying to do, and when he was doing this?
Yeah. So in the early 90s, this theory emerged. One of the things that I didn't have space in the piece to get into, but there's actually a sort of funny kind of priority dispute among the conspiracy theorists as to who was the first to actually come up with this theory. But in any event, somehow this theory gets out there that by this point, it had been understood that the HIV virus that causes AIDS had jumped at some point from chimpanzees in Central Africa to humans. and the question was, how and when did this happen? So this theory that sort of took hold in some corners of the early internet, and there were a few important sort of journalistic advocates of this theory. The theory was that there was this massive oral polio vaccination campaign in the 50s in the territory that was at the time the Belgian Congo. And the theory was that this vaccine had been secretly manufactured with chimpanzee tissue from local chimpanzees, and that in the process of making this vaccine with the chimpanzee tissue, the virus had actually infected the vaccine supply. And so, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of residents of the Belgian Congo were delivered this vaccine that was laced with HIV. So the irony was that in attempting to vaccinate against polio, modern medicine had in fact unleashed this even more catastrophic epidemic upon humanity. So W.D. Hamilton, who at the time is, arguably the preeminent evolutionary biologist in the world, hears about this theory as this journalist is working on this massive book trying to propose it, and he's been mulling over these kinds of social Darwinist arguments for a long time. He's really concerned that modern medicine is actually getting too good at sort of saving the inferior. Yeah. So he says, this is perfect. This is the best indictment of vaccination imaginable. If this story gets out and is widely accepted, no one's going to take a vaccine again because it might have HIV.
Right.
So
wow, God, it's such an incredible. I hadn't heard this story before, and I'm familiar with. I've read And the Band Played On, Randy Schultz, and all the controversy around that, and his sort of hypothesis that was disproven, I think, about there was transmissions and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So that this research project started. I was really interested in this theory that emerged earlier in the 80s, that there was this guy, this Canadian flight attendant who, went around the entire, northern hemisphere having sex with everyone and giving them HIV, and it totally ruined his life. So I was interested in this, and then I as I was digging more into these theories, I discovered this later theory, which was to me was even more interesting. So the sort of fulcrum of this theory is this idea that these scientists secretly made this vaccine on site in the Congo with chimpanzees from this one specific area. So Hamilton said, if I go to this area in the Congo and I get samples from these chimpanzees, and it turns out that they are carrying a virus that is really, really close genetically to HIV, that will be the clincher, because we'll see the smoking gun. These chimpanzees in this specific site, the closest match we have in chimpanzees to HIV, it'll be obvious. So he goes to the Congo. He's in his 60s at this point. There's a civil war. It's people in his life are sort of mystified as to why he's doing this, and he gets malaria and he dies. And this is how this sort of titan of evolutionary biology meets his unlikely end, trying to get these samples to prove this theory. And then it all falls apart after he dies. It turns out that there's this. It's kind of this amazing story. This Virology Institute in Britain for like 50 years had a freezer full of samples of the original vaccine so they can do all these tests on it, and it wasn't even made with chimpanzees. So the theory was wrong. Yes. Yeah. That's an important disclaimer. It's a fascinating story, but in addition to being put to morally repugnant ends, is also just demonstrably incorrect.
That, to me, the whole idea, I just want to underline what you said about Hamilton's attitude that modern medicine is getting too good at saving the inferior. I mean, to me, that's sort of like such a key way of putting it, and particularly the anti-vaccination movement seems like that's part of it. And to me, I mean, people were calling Trump people, MAGA people, whatever, a death cult. You know, almost like cheering on, like we're going to hang out together, and it's hard not to see it that way when you hear it put that way. That like, well, the weak, it's almost like a confidence that I'm strong and like the weak will die, and that's that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the, I haven't, you know, this is one of these sort of connections on the level of sort of, you know, I think it's very subconscious. You know, a lot of the people don't, you know, necessarily explicitly think in these terms. But one thing that really strikes me about the anti-vax movement is the one conspiracy theory everyone knows is that vaccines cause autism.
Right.
You know, and the medical establishment is covering this up. So one thing that's interesting to me as a historian of science about this theory is that in the mid 20th century, it was very commonly believed that autism was caused by overprotective, smothering parenting and mothering in particular. And it was the sort of extreme form of this very widespread concern that contemporary mothers in post-war America were emasculating their children. You know, that men weren't growing up to be men because they had these, you know, really hyperactive mothers who had nothing to do with themselves in these post-war suburban homes, and just, you know, so they sort of insulated their children from you know all the dangers of the world, and so the children withdrew into themselves and became autistic in the extreme form. And I think, you know, again, even though, you know, people who believe in this conspiracy theory about vaccines may not see it in these terms, I think there's this direct lineage of these concerns about, you know, sort of modern society not producing the men that it once did because it doesn't expose them to dangers in the world. It doesn't root out the weaklings. You know, it doesn't, you know, promote the development of this sort of tough masculinity. And so, you know, Joe Rogan, obviously, I think you're exactly right to see him in that lineage. You know, some of these other sort of intellectual dark web affiliates, you know, John Haidt, the psychologist, you know, that produced this book, The Coddling of the American Mind. You know, it's the same concern, I think, reborn, this idea that, you know, we've gotten too good at keeping people, you know, safe and protected, and so we'll no longer have the tough guys that we once did.
God, it's so long. I mean, you talk about a lineage. I mean, it's all of American history, and longer than that. But God, I'm thinking about like Teddy Roosevelt and sort of, you know, his conservation efforts. We regard him as this, you know, one of the first like major figures to pursue environmentalist policies. But if you look at like his ideology connected to that stuff, a lot of it was about like virility and masculinity and like keeping a wild part of the nation where men could, you know, encounter the sort of dangers that they need to encounter in order to become men. They're certainly not wearing masks out there.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I'm just thinking about like how long did it take Trump to even appear in public in a mask? Like, and it seemed entirely tied to masculinity and I would say homophobia as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and again, this is, I mean, this was what initially got me interested in HIV. I mean, there's this story that there was in the 86 Republican National Convention, there was a prominent attendee who wore a button that said AIDS, it's killing all the right people. And this really, you know, again, this idea that maybe it's actually good that we have these that nature has given us this mechanism of sort of calling the weak, and in the case of HIV AIDS, that's obviously so bound up in homophobia, but it extends well beyond that. And, you know, I mean, who do we see now cheering on is trying to position himself as the heir to the Trump movement. It's Josh Hawley who wrote a book about how much he idolized Theodore Roosevelt. At the first
aren't
year.
these people like fucking pro-life too? Like that's what you know what I mean? Like there's some irony upon irony, because the right wing I also associate with being anti-abortion, being never stopping talking about the 3,000 dead at 9/11, and like how much. And so in other words, there's a kind of convenience of life having value.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think there is, if I wanted to read the sort of unconscious of a lot of the pro-life movement, I think it actually is the same sort of, real obsession with reproductive fitness and with the act of reproduction. And you hear, I mean, all of the most common pro-life meme is like, how many Einsteins do we abort, every year?
Jesus. Yeah.
It's this obsession that, there's this sort of potential to improve the stock, that abortion is sort of closing off this sort of glorious reproductive future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like I said, I mean, it's an attitude that is sort of everywhere in one way or another. One of the places that it surprised me is sort of like in the psychedelic counterculture, like Burning Man type people. I read a lot of that stuff in the 90s and 2000s. There were a lot of writers that were sort of connecting a new psychedelic culture to environmentalism and things like that. But I've also seen like a lot of people go down the rabbit hole of like taking ayahuasca and DMT and coming back with these sort of revelations, and coming back with these sort of like, well, if people die, people die. That's just the order of things. And it's just like, it's a weird sort of enlightenment. Like that connection is troubling to me.
Yeah. And this is something that I am writing about in my dissertation. My dissertation is about how a lot of these ideas have this surprising relationship to the world of work and to scientific thinking about work and about management. And that's a domain where, again, there's this, we think of psychedelics as promoting this sort of, dropout leisure culture, but, really the people who are, at the vanguard of this movement right now are people who think that this is going to really boost productivity in white collar workplaces.
Microdosing.
Microdosing, right? And you can trace this all the way back to the 50s and 60s, where a lot of these sort of early figures in the world of psychedelics, people like the psychologist Abraham Maslow or the Harvard psychologist Henry Murray. These are people who see psychedelics as being able to help with the cultivation of an elite, that by psychedelics, people will be sort of pushed through the fetters of sort of normal, conformist society and take a stride the development of humanity. And there's almost this sort of Ayn Rand, master class.
It sounds like Steve Jobs to me.
Yeah.
It's sort of like emerging out of the hippie 60s and sort of envisioning. I mean, to me, it's immensely cynical because it's sort of like envisioning this kind of like hypercolor, counterculture consumerism, but located through these sort of products that you access. I mean, the sort of that intersection to me is interesting because there's that. I connect it to boomer culture. I connect it to the 60s. You mentioned the Beatles. There's a little dig. I don't know if it's a dig, but there's a little Beatles thing in there with this Hamilton guy. Because it does seem like connected to a certain generation. But I don't know if you've ever heard of Terrence McKenna. Have you ever read his stuff? Like, he was a 90s, one of these psychedelic dudes that I think many of us in Silicon Valley were listening to. But like, I had a tweet about it earlier this week because I was like, I don't know. Terence McKenna, if he were alive, all he talked about was how much he hated capitalism and how much he hated patriarchy. And to him, psychedelics were like deconditioning agents from those values. And never really lost his perspective on like the value of human life and the value of, I don't know, silly concepts like love and cooperation. And so I feel like there is, in other words, a psychedelic possibility for a kind of like left or anti-capitalism, but yeah, the direction of things lately has been pretty ugly.
Well, it's sort of like, again, what we were talking about earlier with environmentalism. There's this sort of, this contradiction, this way that, a sort of basic idea can be taken in extremely different directions by different people with different agendas.
I love the history of science as a discipline. I don't know enough about it. We've had a few people from history of science departments on before. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this discipline, how you even discovered this discipline exists? Because to me, it's so key. In part because in higher education all the way to today, there's this split between like STEM and the humanities, and I feel like history of science is a really good example of like how those things are and should be more, kind of considered in tandem. How did you get to history of science? Is it something that has followed you throughout your education?
Yeah, well, the basic answer for me is the basic answer of a lot of people, just that I came into college thinking that I wanted to do science, and then, I did it. And then I realized that while I was interested in science, I definitely did not want to be a scientist. And so, I happened to stumble onto, some courses that sort of thought about science in social and historical perspective. And it was this kind of aha moment of like, yeah, right. I'm interested in science and scientists and scientific ideas, but I don't want to work in a lab. I want to understand, how this institution has shaped the world and had an effect on people's lives, and then for me too, part of it was about learning about the history of science and the history of the sort of modern gay and LGBT movement and community are really profoundly intertwined, going back to the late 19th century when, as some scholars will say, the sort of concept of a homosexuality first emerged out of the sort of scientific thinking about the human and about human behavior. And then, later on, the HIV AIDS epidemic is a pivotal event in the history of medicine and the biological sciences, as well as, one of the pivotal events in the history of the LGBT community. So for me too, there was a sort of, personal component to my interest, which is, I think shared by a lot of people in the discipline, because science is so, you can't think about the history of, gender, of race. My work is again about scientific thinking about work and class. The sciences have been so central to shaping, the way that people sort of experience power and the way that people understand themselves.
That's such a great way of putting it, and even the way that like when you think about science, you're thinking about the way that capitalism and structures and systems and politics like get into your body, and that to me, like, I don't know, it's a whole other episode we could do, I think, you and I talking about picking apart the documentary How to Survive a Plague, but I showed that documentary in a number of my classes to students that were very, like young, SJW type students, like very woke students, LGBT community students, students of Black Lives Matter. Like they were very hip, but they had never heard that. Like they'd never seen like how, like they never understood the terms of like that it was war, you know, and I mean that like in the sense of like people are dying left and right. They are fighting for their very lives. And you know, the war analogy is another conversation as well. But either way, they never heard this stuff. And to me, it's like that. You know, when you talk about history of science, talking about history in general. Like to me, like this story of what happened with AIDS in America and all the ideologies that came out are things that are still buried. Like they're still like they're not like it's not a story that we tell. We tell the other stories about AIDS, I feel like, but this one is really, really deep and dark.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, when I was in high school, I had the chance to see Cleve Jones, who's one of the first generation of AIDS activists, speak. And you know, this is where I first heard this story I told earlier about the Republican National Convention in the mid '80s, and you know, to me as a teenager, you know, this completely blew my mind because, you know, this was back in the days when even Democrats had to talk about how much they loved Ronald Reagan, you know, and this story that's completely suppressed from the memory of that period. And I've been thinking about it the past couple of weeks too. You know, I don't want to take a very forceful position on this debate, but you know, there's been a lot of talk about the concept of fascism and the value of making some of these analogies. And you know, I understand the different arguments that people are mulling over, but I've been reminded of the centrality of the language of genocide and of imagery in the AIDS activist movement, hearkening back to the Nazi persecution of homosexual people, which was it's the most, in some ways, it's the most enduring part of the iconography of ACT UP and the other movements from that time, the Pink Triangle, and you know, so I think there is, you know, again, you know, not to come down on one side or another of this debate that I think is complicated, but I think that this, you know, there's real value, I think, to tracing out these sorts of connections and echoes and rhymes and in history and sort of preserving this.
I agree.
Yeah.
100%. I mean, to me, like, I have no problem when I hear something like modern medicine is getting too good at saving the inferior, that is fascism to me. You know, I have no problem saying that. And what's interesting to me though, too, is like how so many of these people will sort of deny that when you say it like that, when you put it in those terms, when you say like, well, what you're saying is that life doesn't matter and you don't care if my mother dies. They say, oh, wait, no. Of course not. You know, that to me, that's part of how dangerous the ideology is as well. Like in that we don't call it fascism, or maybe if we do, we do it in a sort of you know, satirical way or something like that.
Yeah.
To me, it's like we should understand the terms of what, and we should call out like what you're really saying when you say, I'm not going to get vaccinated because vaccines give you AIDS or give you autism. You know, you're participating in a discourse that is connected historically, consciously, and subconsciously to fascism.
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree with all of that, and I think, you know, in some ways the central theme of most of my writing is a reminder that, you know, reactionary, powerful people can criticize the status quo or what they perceive as the status quo as well. And I think that this really throws people for a loop because, you know, especially for people, you know, who sort of entered into political discourse at a particular time, dominated by sort of, you know, end of history ideas, the idea there's this sort of sense that our biggest enemies on the left are people who think that the world is perfect as it is and nothing needs to change at all. But in fact, if you if you look at the bigger picture of right-wing ideology, Bill Hamilton certainly did not think the world was perfect as is. He thought the world was actually really, really bad and heading in the wrong direction because modern medicine was saving too many lives that shouldn't be saved. And there's this sort of push to say, well, I think that modern medicine has done bad things. He thinks modern medicine has done bad things. There must be some room for sort of dialogue or strategic alliance here, because we both have critiques of, the medical establishment. But that's that. This is not an alliance that's worth making. Is message.
Yeah, there's just so much great stuff in your work, and I'm really looking forward to reading your stuff on kind of entrepreneurialism, because it's and not only that, but like the larger picture of capitalism, because it seems like it fits in with this idea that capitalism isn't natural. We know that capitalism, and the idea that if we're pursuing this sort of let nature take its course thing, then why construct these markets and banks and financial institutions in this very particular way to benefit one particular class? To me, it's pretty disingenuous. And be opposed. They're making ideological sort of judgments all the time that are meant to sort of rig the story of who benefits and who doesn't. Right? Like, in other words, they're gaming evolution too, and they should, and that part of it is, and they're gaming evolution in the most profound ways. These are the people that create the structures that enslave the world. So that part of it is pretty infuriating because it's so disingenuous.
Yeah, and it's really, to me, it's about, I think, fundamentally, it's about this fear that if it's too obvious that existing people in power are deliberately changing the world, then other sorts of people might get the idea that they can change the world too.
Right.
And this is, so in my dissertation, I start with this moment in the early 20th century, which I think is the root of a lot of these concerns about sort of right-wing concerns about science out of control, which is this era of scientific management or Taylorism in firms. And there were actually a lot of right-wing pro-capitalist people who were unsettled by this trend. Not because they thought that the Taylorists were sort of secret left-wingers or they had any problem with workers being treated like machines, but there was something very disturbing to them about the idea of showing the managerial hand so openly to workers and revealing to workers, that you sort of systematically could plan these large organizations, because maybe then they would think that they should have a role in this planning process, or they could sort of participate actively. So then, the people that I write about spent the next century devising different ways to try to conceal the operation of that sort of managerial hand, and to sort of make even factories and other kinds of workplaces seem like this sort of natural organism, despite the fact there's nothing less natural than a factory, but somehow they can conceive of it that way.
So yeah, I mean, it's the same old story. I mean, it's like social Darwinism is a way to rationalize the inequality that capitalism is creating, right? I mean, when you look at a map, and this has come up on our show before, and I'm sure you've seen this, but like, look at a map of like where the most COVID deaths happen in New York City, for instance. It's a map of class inequality, and it makes, when I look at your work, Erik, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. It makes me think that like class war is biological war, and like there's such a deep, visceral bodily sense of that in the COVID year. It's really, you're on top of some shit that I think is going to be stuff we're going to be talking about for a long time.
Well, I certainly hope so. Again, in terms of the idea of memory, as we there's already, this sort of urge to say, thank God the vaccines are finally here. We're turning a corner. We can see light at the end of the tunnel. And of course, all of that is great, but a real injustice, on a kind of mind-boggling scale was done in the last year. It was politicized. It was, I think that's the right way to put it. It was an act of biological and class warfare simultaneously. And I think I hope that's something that we on the left can keep alive, the memory of that injustice.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. Because you can see even liberals burying it with the hero discourse of service workers and things like that. And you're like, this sort of like sacrificial language, and even like a religious language in the inauguration with the sort of honoring the essential workers and stuff like that. There's a macabre energy for sure. And the left needs to, I think, keep it up. It's tricky though, because it's such a celebration right now that Trump is gone. I mean, it's a really, really tricky politics. But Erik Baker, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay, I want to thank my guest, Erik Baker. Go check out that article in the Drift Mag, The Cure and the Disease, Social Darwinism from AIDS to COVID-19. Erik's doing really, really great work on this stuff. And to me, it's like just an absolutely insane story and an angle on AIDS and conspiracy theory and vaccinations that I'd never really considered before. So go check that out. And thank you, Erik, for coming on the show. Go check out our live stream, too. We're live every Thursday, 1 p.m. on YouTube with Justin Rogers Cooper talking about whatever is going on this week. So come by and join us. And if you can't, you can listen to those as a patron at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And thanks so much for the people that are supporting the show. It really warms our heart and helps us keep going. So thanks very much, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. See ya.